Hello and welcome back to the Hazzabhajan YouTube channel. It is Harry here, and today it is time for the follow-up video to last week's video on every World Cup's underachiever. Now we're going to take a look at the opposite end of the spectrum and look at every World Cup's overachiever. Much like a tournament's underachiever, but obviously flipped on its head, every World Cup has an overachieving side that nobody really expected to do well pre-tournament, but surpassed everything that was predicted of them, be it a minnow of the tournament making it deep into the competition, or an underperforming side who somehow dragged themselves through to the later stages. Therefore, as you might have guessed, I decided to go through every single World Cup tournament and pick out the team which performed better than expected, or a team who didn't deserve to reach the stage that they reached based on things like performance levels, or team quality, or anything like that. Like last time, I'm looking at it through the context of the caliber of the team at the time and not through modernized. So for example, Hungary reaching the 1954 World Cup final wasn't an overachievement at the time, but obviously if they reached the World Cup final now, it would be a massive overachievement. So I hope that clears everything up, and without any further ado, here is every single World Cup's overachieving team from 1930 until 2018. 1930, Yugoslavia. The right answer here is probably the USA, considering they lost in the semi-finals, much like Yugoslavia did, but I'm going with the European nation as a result of the extra travel problems that they had to face. No European side originally wanted to take part before FIFA convinced four, namely Belgium, Romania, France and Yugoslavia, to make the long voyage to Uruguay, which could take up to 6 weeks, and all of them barring Yugoslavia went out in the group stages. However, they beat the much fancied Brazilians 2-1 and then Bolivia 4-0 to progress from their group, and admittedly they were beaten 6-1 by Uruguay in the semi-finals, but then again the USA also lost 6-1, in their case to Argentina, so I guess you can consider my decision relatively justified. 1934, Germany. Not the only appearance for the Germans in this list, they weren't particularly fancy going into their first World Cup appearance in 1934, given that the country was in a state of upheaval and there weren't too many star names kicking about, apart from maybe Fritz Stefan, Vidi Kres and a couple of others. The Italian press, perhaps in an attempt to stir up some controversy, labelled them as one of the worst sides in the competition, but they beat Belgium 5-2 and then Sweden 2-1 to book a date with Czechoslovakia in the semi-finals. Although they lost, they would win the newly established third-place playoff match against their bitter rivals Austria's Wunder team, taking home a bronze medal few would have anticipated them to gain. 1938, Cuba. It was a choice of either Sweden or Cuba, who coincidentally met each other in the 1938 quarter-finals, although Sweden did admittedly receive a bye in the first round as a result of Austria's annexation by Germany, meaning that they weren't eligible to take part in the 1938 tournament. With that considered, even though they were on the wrong end of an 8-0 mauling by the Swedes in that particular game, I've gone with Cuba, as it was a miracle for them to just be there in the first place, considering the travel expenses, the fact that they were only there as a result of Mexico's withdrawal from the competition, and the additional fact that they hadn't even played a game in 3 years. So it was a miracle for them to be there, let alone even win a game. However, that's exactly what they did. After drawing with Romania 3-3, their manager confidently told the press that they would win the replay 2-1, and lo and behold, that is exactly what transpired. Admittedly, they came very unstuck against the Swedes, but considering they won a game, I think it's only fair to say that they overachieved spectacularly at this tournament. 1950, Uruguay. After missing out on the 2 previous World Cup tournaments owing to financial issues, Uruguay made their first appearance at a World Cup since they won it in 1930. With 2 teams withdrawing from their group, they only had to play 1 game to qualify for the second group stage, annihilating Bolivia 8-0 to book their place. After drawing their first game against Sweden and scraping past Spain in their second, expectations were low in the winner-takes-all match against the host Brazil, but Uruguay defied the odds and the 200,000 crowd at the Maracanã to defeat the Seleção. The unknown quantity had become a world champion. And if you want to watch a video that I've done on that subject, I will leave a link to it in the description. 1954, West Germany. Only one team was going to win the 1954 World Cup, and that team was Hungary. They scored a staggering 17 goals in their 2 group stage games, including 8 past the second string West German side, before beating both Brazil and Uruguay 4-2 to reach the final. They would face West Germany once again, but in spite of taking a 2-0 lead within 10 minutes, the magical Magyars threw it away and West Germany would end up winning 3-2. Any team who managed to beat the Hungarians were going to be the overachievers at this World Cup, and it just so happened to be, in of all games, the final. Much like the 1950 World Cup final, I've also made a video on the 1954 World Cup final, which, as you might have guessed, you can check out in the description. I'm all about those shameless plugs today, clearly. 1958, Wales. All 4 British sides would qualify for the first, and to date only time, for the 1958 World Cup. And whilst England and Scotland were expected to do really well, and Wales and Northern Ireland fall by the wayside, the reality was quite the opposite. Both of the underdogs would qualify for the knockouts, whilst England and Scotland failed to make it out of their groups. Although I've gone with Wales as they put up stubborn resistance against the eventual champions Brazil in the quarter-finals, only losing 1-0. Northern Ireland, by contrast, were humbled 4-0 by France in their quarter-final clash, meaning that Wales take the crown, for me, in their only World Cup appearance to date. 1962, Chile. The first hosts to feature in this video, Chile gained their best ever World Cup finish in 1962, finishing in 3rd after beating Yugoslavia in the 3rd place playoff. In their previous 2 attempts, Chile had failed to make it past the first round, but after the Battle of Santiago against the Italians saw them emerge triumphant, even if they did have the living daylights kicked out of them by the Italians, and, admittedly, vice versa, they finished 2nd in their group, behind West Germany. Russia were defeated in the quarters before Brazil put paid to any Chilean aspirations with a 4-2 win in the semi-finals, but the hosts had done themselves proud. 1966, North Korea. One of the great World Cup underdog stories was provided by the plucky North Koreans in 1966. The British public warmed to the Korean side and fervently backed them in each of their group games, and despite losing 3-0 to the USSR in their debut World Cup match, they drew with Chile before astonishingly beating Italy 1-0 to qualify at their expense. What's more, they raced into a 3-0 lead against the Eusebio-inspired Portugal in the quarter-finals, and although Portugal would end up turning the game around to win 5-3, the squad had won the hearts of the unwatching public with their grit, determination and convivial attitude. 1970, Uruguay. Throughout the tournament, Uruguay would score a grand total of just 4 goals in 6 games, but dragged themselves kicking and screaming all the way to the semi-finals, where they lost to the greatest World Cup side of all time in the form of Brazil. After making it through the group stages on goal difference ahead of Sweden, they only just about got past the USSR in extra time, but they didn't score more than 1 goal in any of their games across the entire tournament. They would end up losing the 3rd place playoff to West Germany, perhaps aptly enough, 1-0. 1974, East Germany. Yes, this was East Germany's only appearance at a World Cup. Yes, they would only accrue 1 point in their second group stage against formidable opposition like Argentina, Brazil and the Netherlands. And yes, they would also have to play West Germany and Chile, both of whom were not particularly popular in East Germany at the time. However, they would beat Australia, and then stunningly, they managed to overcome their neighbours 1-0 in the only East Germany versus West Germany match to ever take place, meaning that the East German side had a 100% record against their closest rivals. A draw with Chile saw them top the group ahead of the eventual winners of West Germany, before a 2nd round group stage of hell saw them depart. 1978, Peru. Inspired by the legendary Teofilo Cubillas, who would end up as the 2nd top scorer in the whole tournament behind Mario Kempes, Peru would top their first group stage in spectacular fashion, beating Scotland 3-1 and Iran 4-1 before managing to keep the Netherlands, the eventual World Cup finalists, at bay with a 0-0 draw. Admittedly, when at the 2nd group stage, they lost all of their games without scoring a goal and conceding 10, including 6 to Argentina in an extremely dubious game, but the team who had been summarily written off before a ball had even been kicked have proved all the doubters wrong. 1982, West Germany. By 1982, the West German supporters had lost complete interest in their side, as the players were perceived to be functional and only interested in winning, foregoing style or grace in the process. This would come to the fore after the disgrace of Gijon, when they intentionally beat Austria 1-0 to allow both sides to qualify for the next round at Algeria's expense. The players and manager were all unremorseful in the aftermath, and after scraping through the 2nd group phase ahead of England and Spain, more controversy would arise in their semi-final against France. Goalkeeper Harald Schumacher knocked France's Patrick Battiston out cold, yet somehow wasn't sent off and stood there waiting for the game to resume so that he could take his goal kick, despite Battiston's obviously perilous situation. Perhaps one of the most undeserving finalists in history, they managed to beat the French on penalties before being put to the sword by Italy 3-1 in the final, and they returned home as a disgrace to the nation. 1986, Mexico. Mexico have only reached the quarterfinals twice in their World Cup history, and both came when they were hosts of the competition. This was one of those tournaments, as they topped their group ahead of Paraguay and Iran, as well as Belgium, who came close to featuring here as well, as they finished third in the group but fourth in the overall tournament, their best finish until 2018. They would overcome Bulgaria in the round of 16, but then they would lose to West Germany on penalties, and barring Real Madrid's Hugo Sanchez, none of their squad were household names and all played locally, so it was a bit of a surprise to see them in the quarterfinals. 1990, Ireland. The Republic of Ireland didn't win a single game in regular time or extra time during the World Cup finals, yet they somehow staggered their way to the quarterfinals. If that isn't overachieving, then I don't know what is. They drew all of their group games against England, Holland and Egypt, with England the only side to actually win a game during the entire group, and Ireland finished second ahead of the Dutch only by virtue of the drawing of lots, as both teams finished on an identical record, although both went through anyway, so it didn't really make much of a difference either way. Romania were dispatched on penalties after a 0-0 draw before they lost to Italy 1-0 in the quarterfinals, although they would wreak revenge on the Italians by beating them in their opening game of the 1994 World Cup at Giants Stadium. 1994, Bulgaria. Despite a squad with Borislav Mihailov in goal and Hristo Stoichkov in attack, not much was expected of the Bulgarian side going into the tournament, especially after they lost 3-0 to Nigeria in their opening game. However, they came storming back, thrashing Greece 4-0 and then beating Argentina 2-0 to finish above La Alba Celeste, before a win against Mexico set up a quarter-final showdown with the reigning champions, Germany. In one of the greatest shocks in World Cup history, Jurgen Klinsmann dived for a penalty which Lothar Matthäus obviously converted because he's German and he's guaranteed to score penalties. But in another shock, Bulgaria managed to turn the game around and win it 2-1. They would end up finishing fourth after losing to Italy and then Sweden, but beating the Germans was a massive triumph in and of itself, as was their run to the semi-finals, considering in their previous World Cup attempts they hadn't even won a single game. 1998, Norway. This is a harsh inclusion, I will admit, but the quality of the teams who reached the latter stages of the 1998 World Cup was incredible, and whilst I did consider Croatia's debut team at a World Cup, the squad starred the likes of Slaven Bilic, Robert Prosinecki and Davor Šuker, and perhaps deservedly reached the semi-finals. Let's say Norway, who only won one game at the finals, albeit it was against Brazil, keeping up their unbeaten record against the Seleção, the only team to remain unbeaten against them in any form of international game, yet made it to the round of 16, where they only lost 1-0 to Italy. Honestly, it's not my best selection, but I didn't have much to work with. 2002, South Korea. If you want to talk World Cup overachievers, now we're talking. Co-host South Korea qualified for the knockout stages of a World Cup for the first time in their history in 2002, but their run to the semi-finals had no shortage of controversy. They did dominate their group and won their games fairly, but they received more than their fair share of favourable refereeing decisions against Italy in the round of 16, beating them with a golden goal in extra time, and then their quarter-final opponent Spain saw two perfectly good goals disallowed for no discernible reason. The Koreans would end up winning on penalties, and although their dream was put to an end by Germany in the semi-finals and they would end up finishing fourth after losing the third place playoff to Turkey, who were another overachiever at this World Cup, they did have a talented squad anyway with the likes of Park Ji-sung and An Hyung-kwan, and an amazing manager in Gus Hiddink. However, I don't think anyone would have predicted a semi-final spot for the Korean side in their wildest dreams. Or nightmares if you're Italian or Spanish. 2006, Ukraine. After a 4-0 defeat at the hands of Spain in their opening group game, Ukraine's only World Cup campaign to date didn't exactly have the best of starts, and most assumed they would sink without a trace. However, they beat Saudi Arabia by the same scoreline in their next game, before overcoming Tunisia 1-0 to finish in second behind the Spaniards. Indeed, they would make it further than Spain, as they were knocked out in the second round to France, but Ukraine, despite not scoring a goal in the knockout stages, would end up beating Switzerland on penalties after a 0-0 draw, although their run would come to an end after losing 3-0 to eventual winners Italy in the quarterfinals. Their team was packed with quality with players like Andriy Shevchenko, Sergei Rebrov and Oleg Gusev, but after their first game, expecting them to reach the quarterfinals would probably have been a bit of a stretch. 2010, Paraguay. Honourable mentions go to the likes of Ghana, who reached the quarterfinals, and Uruguay, who knocked out the Black Stars after a controversial Luis Suarez handball, but the right answer here is Paraguay. Although they topped their group, it was a group containing Slovakia, New Zealand and the worst Italy side known to mankind, and they only scored 3 times throughout the group stages. They would squeeze past Japan on penalties in the round of 16 before losing to Spain 1-0 in the quarters. Barring Roque Santa Cruz and Oscar Cardozo, the team wasn't really filled with standout players, and they wouldn't even qualify for the next 2 tournaments, slipping back into mediocrity pretty quickly. 2014, Costa Rica. When the draw came out for the 2014 World Cup and Costa Rica were put in a dangerous looking group with England, Italy and Uruguay, most expected the Latin American nation to be the whipping boys. They defied all expectations by beating Uruguay 3-1 and then Italy 1-0, topping the group to win a round of 16 match against Greece, whom they overcame via a penalty shootout. Their run came to an end in the quarters against the Netherlands, but they put up a decent fight and took the Dutch all the way. The team no one fancied had achieved their best World Cup finish to date. 2018, England. This is controversial, but come on, you know we overachieved in Russia. Whilst expectations were low going into the World Cup, England's results led many to believe that it really was coming home, although they would come crashing down after defeat to Croatia in the semis. However, you have to look at it realistically, as England only managed to beat Tunisia, Panama and Sweden within 90 minutes. They also lost to Belgium twice, as well as obviously Croatia, and just about scraped past Colombia on penalties in the round of 16. Although at least they did win a penalty shootout, so, take it or leave it. Only the game against Panama was a really convincing display, and Tunisia were not beaten until the 90th minute. So based on their performances, England should not even come close to the final, yet they were only one game and extra time in that game away from doing so. That just about concludes today's video. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope that you've enjoyed this two-part series, and let me know if there are any other every X thing in Y or whatever type videos that you want me to do. Stick them down in the comments below, and of course while you're here, hit the like, hit the subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a video whenever I upload one. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you then.